How do I keep my heart rate in zone 2? This is one of the most common questions that runners ask, so in today's episode we're going to be taking a deep dive into what is zone 2 running, why is it important, and how you can make sure that you execute it correctly in order to get the most benefit out of these zone 2 runs. Hi guys, welcome back to the Adaptive Zone podcast. My name's Matthew Boyd. I'm a physiotherapist and running coach. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you're so inclined, share it with a friend. Today we're going to be talking about zone 2 heart rate training, so let's get into it. Actually, before we do that, don't forget to check out my Running Fundamentals course. It is a free course that is delivered entirely online, and it teaches you all the fundamentals of running, training, and performance. So just click the link in the description and you will enter your email and name and you can get one episode per week. So what is zone 2 running? Zone 2 refers to an intensity at which you're working on your aerobic system primarily. So it's a very comfortable pace. Usually you can talk in full sentences and you can sustain that kind of effort for many hours. So why is zone 2 running important? As I said before, what we're trying to do here is build the aerobic base, which is a common term that runners will use to describe the point of these kind of low intensity runs. Now, that being said, building your aerobic base is kind of like an easy way of saying that we're going to focus on some specific physiological adaptations that will occur as a result of running at lower intensities. The first physiological change that we're going to see is more mitochondria. Now, if you remember anything from high school biology, it's probably that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So essentially, when you're running slow in zone 2 with your heart rate in zone 2, you're going to develop more mitochondria within your muscle cells, and the mitochondria that you develop will also be bigger and more powerful. And the idea here is that they will be able to do more and produce more energy with the same amount of glucose and oxygen that they'll get from the blood. Another adaptation that we'll see as a result of these zone 2 runs is more capillary network development. So capillaries are like little teeny blood vessels that kind of mesh their way through the muscles. And when you run slowly in zone 2, your body will be encouraged to develop better networks with more kind of little intricate parts to them. And the idea here is that you will be better able to get blood to the parts of the muscle that are working hard that need the blood, which is going to be how it's going to acquire the glucose and oxygen that you need in order to produce the energy using your mitochondria. So you're sort of better supplying the mitochondria by having a better distribution network, let's say, through those capillary beds. And then the final adaptation that you'd see as a result of all this kind of slower or lower intensity running is more myoglobin. Now, mitochondria tends to get the headlines. It's a bit like the lead singer of the band, whereas the myoglobin is like the drummer. So you really need that myoglobin because what that's going to do is transport the oxygen to the mitochondria so that it can actually use it. And in the same way as we get more mitochondria developed and larger mitochondria when we do this zone 2 based training, it's the same with the myoglobin. So we develop more of them, and the ones that we have get bigger and more efficient. So for the same amount of blood or delivery to the cell, you will get better output of energy. So they'll take the same amount of glucose and oxygen, but actually have a higher energy output in the form of running because you've got more myoglobin, more mitochondria, and both of those things are bigger and more efficient. The best analogy that I've heard to describe this process is a hybrid car, and I got this from the guys over at Runners Connect. And what they described was that the runner's performance was essentially similar to that of a hybrid car, where you have an electric battery and a petroleum gas tank. And the ability of the car to perform and travel a given distance in a given time is determined by the sort of size and efficiency of the electric battery and the gas tank. So to take that analogy a little bit further, the electric battery, that is your aerobic base. So the bigger and stronger that aerobic base, or aerobic battery we might call it, the better you're going to be at going very far, very slowly. So if you're in a hybrid car, you couldn't slow down to the point where you're just using the electric battery, and you can go for a very long time on that battery, but you can't go very fast. Similarly, if you were to speed up, you will be able to go faster, but not for as long because your body would start to use more of the gas. And that would be more akin to in the human body, like the glycolytic system or the anaerobic system. That's your gas tank. And the electric battery is much more like your aerobic system, your aerobic base. So with the Zone 2 running, what we're trying to do is develop a bigger and more efficient, more powerful electric aerobic battery. So how do you know what your Zone 2 heart rate is? Because everybody's is a little bit different. Now, I have an episode and a page on my website called the Training Zone Calculator, so I'll put a link to that in the description. So if you want to go ahead and do the 20-minute test on that page, you can then enter your information in the spreadsheet that it describes. It's all completely free, and that'll tell you exactly what your Zone 2 heart rate is. But for the purposes of this episode, let's just keep it simple. Your Zone 2 heart rate in the 5-zone system that I use is 80 to 95% of your lactate threshold heart rate, okay? Your lactate threshold heart rate is pretty much the heart rate that you can hold for 1 hour. So if you wanted to know what it was, you run as fast as you can for 1 hour, take your average heart rate, let's say it was 162 in this example, then your Zone 2 would be 80 to 95% of that. So if we take that 162, 80, 95% of that is 130 to 153 beats per minute. And these are all my current zones for heart rate. So my current Zone 2 heart rate is 130 to 153. My current lactate threshold heart rate, or my 1 hour heart rate, is 162. So when I'm doing my Zone 2 runs, I'm going to try and keep my heart rate between 130 and 153 beats per minute. So now you know what your Zone 2 heart rate is. You're going to head out for a run and you're going to try and keep your heart rate in that zone. So let's say I'm trying to keep my heart rate in between 130 and 153 because that's my Zone 2 heart rate. And let's say that I go out for a run and I know that I want to do about 80% of my runs in that Zone 2 range. But when I go for a run, I run as slow as I can, so like 8 minutes per kilometer, but still my heart rate is creeping up into Zone 3. So it's going up to like 160 beats per minute, even though I'm actually running as slowly as I can. This is actually a super common problem among people who have just gotten into running, particularly if they're getting into running to get back a sense of health that they've really lost in the last few years. But also it's common among runners who've been running for a long time, but really have never forced themselves to calculate exactly what their Zone 2 heart rate is and make sure they stick to it. So they often end up doing a lot of their training in Zone 3, and when they try and slow down into Zone 2, they actually can't do it. They find that their heart rate shoots straight up into Zone 3. So let's say that happens to you and you can't keep your heart rate in Zone 2. As soon as you start to run, it's shooting up into whatever your Zone 3 is. So for me, that would be like anything over 153 beats per minute. And then, so you go to Google and you're like, how do I keep my heart rate down in Zone 2? And then you get a pile of videos come up that say that you have to do this particular breathing technique or this warm-up or whatever it is, and that'll sort it out. The fact is that tricks don't work. When you're running, your muscles produce energy from oxygen and glucose. They get the oxygen and the glucose from the blood, and if they're producing more energy by running faster, they're going to need more glucose and more oxygen. They're going to get that by more blood coming into the muscle cells. Well, into the muscles themselves, and then the oxygen and glucose is transported into the cells. So they need more blood because they need more oxygen and glucose. So in order to do that, your heart rate will increase to increase the flow of blood to the muscles. So if you're running faster, you need more blood. So your heart beats faster to produce the blood that your muscles need to make you run faster. Anything that tries to reduce your heart rate, all it's going to do is deprive the muscles of the glucose and oxygen that they need to produce that output. So if you actually want to address this problem, get to the place where you can run faster on the same amount of blood, meaning that the heart rate is at a certain level, then you need to make yourself more efficient. You need to increase your capillary networks. You need to have bigger and fatter and more numerous mitochondria, and the same with myoglobin. So if you do all of those things, you'll make yourself more efficient. You can run faster on the same amount of blood, so your heart rate will stay lower. There are no shortcuts here. You have to keep your heart rate in Zone 2 at all costs. So what you're going to do is start to run, and as soon as you see your heartbeat drifting up, so say for me it's drifting up over 153, then it's time to walk. I'm going to walk for 2 minutes until my heart rate comes back down, then I'm going to start to run again. I'm going to run as slowly as I can. So let's say I'm running like 8 minutes per kilometer, which I think is about 13 or 14 minutes per mile, if I remember correctly. But my heart rate still drifts up over 153. I've got to have another walk break. And I'm going to keep doing that to make sure that I keep my heart rate in the allocated zone, which is specifically targeted for me because I did my fitness test, so I know what my zone 2 is. I'm going to keep my heart rate between 130 and 153. And if that means taking lots of walk breaks, that's what I'm going to do. And that's because that's going to send the signal to my body to become more efficient at what I'm doing, because that's how the body adapts. That's the principle of specificity. So when I run slowly at that kind of low heart rate, low speed, my body is going to become more efficient at that. I'm going to develop better capillary networks, more myoglobin, bigger myoglobin, more mitochondria, bigger mitochondria. Essentially what I'm doing is improving the size, the power and the efficiency of that aerobic battery. So if I do that for a long enough time period, I'll become more efficient at what I'm doing, meaning that I'll be able to run faster without my heart rate going up into zone 3. How do you know if your zone 2 running is working? Well, an easy way to do this is just to track your pace at zone 2 heart rate over a period of months. So let's say my heart rate is between 130 and 153 to stay in zone 2. I'm going to do some zone 2 runs, let's say 30 minutes, 60 minutes, whatever it is, keep my heart rate in that zone, and then on my GPS watch or app or whatever you're using, you'll be able to see what your average pace was. If you then continue that for, let's say, 2 months, you could do another run around the same time, see what your average pace is while keeping your heart rate in zone 2. Another 2 months, do it again. What you should see is that your average pace is increasing for those runs, even though your heart rate is staying the same. A more formal way to do this is my 40-minute test, which I do with my athletes on a pretty regular basis, usually about every 8 weeks. I'll get them to do a 40-minute test. And the way to do that is you figure out what the top of your zone 2 is, right? So you go to my training zone calculators page, do the 20-minute test, put your numbers in the spreadsheet and get your zone 2 heart rate. Or if you already know what your zone 2 heart rate is and you're sure that it's correct for you, then you're just going to pick the very top number. So if my zone 2 heart rate is between 130 and 153, I'm going to pick 153. That's my target heart rate. Now I'm going to go for a run. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes just warming up at a nice easy pace. Then I'm going to gradually increase my pace until my heart rate is hovering around 153. Then I'm going to start my watch. And then I'm going to run and keep my eye on my heart rate and try and keep it as close to 153 the entire time as I can. I'm not going to look at my pace at all. I'm just going to look at the heart rate, keep it 153. When I've run for 40 minutes, I'm going to hit stop. Later, when I go and analyze that run, I should see that my average heart rate during that 40 minutes was around 153. I'll then also be able to know what my average pace was. So let's say it was 7 minutes and 40 seconds per kilometer. Then I'm going to repeat that 40-minute test at a set interval. I would recommend either every 4 or 8 weeks. The reason being is that changes in your aerobic system take time, so we don't want them to be too close together, not weekly or bi-weekly. So let's set at least 4 weeks out, but more like 8. And then I'm going to redo the 40-minute test. Again, I'm going to run, start my watch, and keep my heart rate at 153. When I do it 8 weeks later, if I've been doing the majority of my training in zone 2 with my heart rate in that zone, I should find that my average pace on that test when I repeat it 8 weeks later is better. So let's say instead of 7 minutes and 40 seconds, it's like 7 minutes and 28 seconds. Then I do the same thing. I continue to train in zone 2 quite a lot of the time, at least 80% of my training. 8 weeks later, I repeat the 40-minute test again. And I should find that at that same heart rate, 153, now I can run, 720 minutes per kilometer. Do it again. 8 weeks later, same heart rate, 153. Okay, now I'm hitting like 7 minutes and 5 seconds per kilometer. And what that represents is an improvement in my aerobic base because I've made that aerobic battery bigger and more efficient. So now I don't have to use as much gas, which is our glycolytic system. I can rely on my aerobic system, which is the oxidative system, to power my running and take me forward at a pace of about 7 minutes per kilometer, primarily just using that aerobic engine, that aerobic battery. Now, as you can tell, it takes a while, right? So I wouldn't really be too panicked if I didn't see too much change 8 weeks apart. But by 16 weeks, if I've been training properly, I should see that that pace is significantly improved. And certainly if you're testing this every 3 to 6 months, you should see that if you're training correctly and doing most of your training with your heart rate in that zone 2, that your pace at that same heart rate at the top of your zone 2 will gradually increase. The reason this is helpful is that on race day, your performance on race day is determined by the sum of your aerobic battery and your anaerobic gas tank. So the bigger the two things are, the faster you'll run on race day. So we want to make both as big as we can, as big and as efficient and as powerful as we can. So the zone 2 running is really trying to develop a really robust, strong and powerful aerobic battery by creating more mitochondria that are bigger and fatter, by creating more myoglobin that's bigger and fatter, and by creating denser capillary networks, or said another way, building an aerobic base, building an aerobic battery. If you make that side of your physiology as well developed as you can, then when you pair that with the gas tank, which we'll talk about in other episodes, but that's your faster running speed, your anaerobic speeds, then you can propel yourself faster for a given heart rate, meaning that you're more efficient. So for a given amount of effort, you will move further. And that's the purpose of the zone 2 training. And this emphasis on improving your aerobic base, particularly for endurance events or anything longer than like 3 kilometers, it's super important. And that's why you hear of 80-20, right? So 80-20 is 80% of your training at a lower intensity. And it's because we're really trying to focus on building that aerobic battery as big as we can. So on race day, we can rely on it to do most of the work for us.